My stepmother looked me in the eye in that conference room and said, "She's not really family. She's just a name someone typed on a form 30 years ago." The notary stopped mid-sentence. My father stared at the table, and I sat there in my charcoal blazer, hands folded, saying nothing. I had been waiting for that moment for a long time. Not the insult. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. I was waiting for what came next. My mother died when I was 6. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless. My father remarried 18 months later. I used to think 18 months was quick. Now that I'm older, I understand grief does strange things to people. It can make you cling to the nearest warm body just to stop the bleeding. I understand it. I don't forgive it, but I understand it. My stepmother, I'll call her what she always made clear she was, came into the house with 2 suitcases, a very specific opinion about how children should behave, and absolutely no interest in becoming anyone's mother. She was cordial in the way that people are cordial when they want something. She smiled at my father. She reminded me regularly that she wasn't replacing anyone. She wasn't. She was something else entirely. Growing up, I learned to be quiet. I learned to take up very little space. I did my homework at the kitchen table without being asked. I kept my room clean. I thanked her for dinners I didn't eat much of. My father worked long hours. He was a civil engineer, gone before I woke up most mornings. And so it was mostly just the 2 of us in that house in Naperville, Illinois. Me and a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that tolerating me was the most she was willing to offer. I'm not saying she was cruel in ways that leave marks you can point to. She never hit me. She never screamed. She was simply cold in the way that a house can be cold, not because something is broken, but because no one bothered to turn the heat on. My mother had left a trust. I didn't know the full details until I was in college, but her parents, my grandparents, had set it up before she died. A modest amount, enough to help me with school, with starting out. My mother had made sure of that. She'd thought about me even when she was dying, which is the kind of thing that takes your breath away when you really sit with it. The trust was managed through a small firm in downtown Chicago. I received disbursements for college tuition, no issues. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't meant to be. It was my mother saying, "I see you. I made sure you'd have something." When my grandmother, my mother's mother, passed away 2 years ago, her estate included a final addition to that trust. She had updated her will in her last year of life. The amount was significant. A lake house in Wisconsin that had been in the family for 3 generations, plus the cash value of an annuity she'd held for decades. Together, a little over $800,000 in assets. That's when everything changed. My father called me in March. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Tight, rehearsed. He said he wanted to talk about grandmother's estate. He said there were some questions about the documentation. He said my stepmother had been in contact with the estate attorney and they just wanted to make sure everything was in order. I told him I'd be in touch with my own attorney. There was a pause. "You have an attorney?" he said. "I do now," I said. "I should tell you what I do for a living because it matters to what happens next. I'm a federal prosecutor. I've been with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois for 4 years. Before that, I clerked for a circuit court judge for 2 years after law school. I graduated from Northwestern Law in the top 8% of my class. I don't say any of this to impress you. I say it because my father and stepmother spent 30 years treating me like a problem to be managed, and they had constructed, in their minds, a version of me that was still 6 years old, still quiet, still taking up very little space. They had no idea who I had become, partly because they'd never asked, partly because I had never volunteered it. I learned early that information is power, and I had gotten very careful about what I handed to people who had already shown me what they'd do with it. My attorney, a sharp estate litigator named Whitfield, who I'd been referred to through a colleague, told me that my stepmother had filed a challenge to my grandmother's amended will. The grounds were thin. They were claiming my grandmother lacked testamentary capacity when she made the amendment, and that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly woman. My grandmother had been sharp as a tack until the month she died. She'd beaten me at Scrabble at Christmas 2 years before her passing. She drove herself to her own doctor's appointments. She had opinions about every Supreme Court case argued that term and wanted to discuss them at dinner. Undue influence. Testamentary capacity. I read the filing 3 times. Then I called Whitfield and told him to prepare everything we had. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning in April at the offices of the estate attorney, a neutral location meant to be a preliminary discussion before anything escalated further. My father's attorney, a man named Greer, who I'd heard of vaguely through the legal community, had suggested it. I agreed. I wore the charcoal blazer. I drove myself. I got there 8 minutes early and sat in the lobby drinking bad coffee and going over notes I didn't actually need to review because I had reviewed them enough times that they lived in my body by then. Whitfield met me at the elevator. He gave me a look that said, "Ready?" I gave him one back that said, "Let's go." The conference room was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long mahogany table, a view of the city that probably cost someone a lot of money to be able to see every day. My father was already seated when I walked in. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had been Thanksgiving 2 years before, a stiff and quiet dinner that none of us had particularly enjoyed. My stepmother sat to his right. She had that particular posture she always had, straight-backed, composed, the posture of someone who has decided in advance that they are right about everything. Greer sat across from Whitfield. The estate attorney, a woman named Alderton, who was technically neutral in this proceeding, sat at the head of the table. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. My stepmother opened. She said this was a difficult situation and that no one wanted conflict. She said my grandmother had been unwell in her final year. She said she and my father had been the ones visiting regularly, caring for her, checking in. She said that my influence over an isolated elderly woman had led to decisions that weren't in keeping with my grandmother's actual wishes. I watched her talk. I had spent years watching her talk at holiday dinners, at the few school events my father had attended, in the kitchen of the house in Naperville, when she thought she was explaining something I was too young to understand. She had a particular rhythm when she was building towards something she wanted, a kind of gathering quality, like a storm deciding whether to commit. She was committing now. She said, "She's not really family. She's just a name someone typed on a form 30 years ago." The room went quiet. Alderton set down her pen. My father looked at the table. Whitfield looked at me. I looked at my stepmother and said nothing. Greer cleared his throat. He said, carefully, that they weren't here to relitigate family relationships, but to discuss the estate documentation. And then Alderton said something I hadn't expected. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at Greer. She said, in a voice that was very measured and very deliberate, "Counselor, I want to make sure I understand who we're discussing. Are you and your clients aware of Miss Gussing?" Alderton's professional position? Greer blinked. "I'm sorry, the petitioner," Alderton said. "Are you aware of where she works, what she does?" Greer looked at my father. My father looked at my stepmother. My stepmother's posture, for the first time I could ever remember, shifted. Whitfield opened a folder in front of him. He slid a document across the table. It was a copy of my bar admission, my position with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a letter that Whitfield had prepared at my request, summarizing 4 years of federal prosecution work including public corruption cases, fraud, and estate-related financial crimes. It also included a note about the fact that I had spent the last 6 weeks requesting financial records from my grandmother's estate and had found, with Whitfield's help, a series of transfers made in the 14 months before her death. Transfers from my grandmother's personal accounts to a joint account held by my father and stepmother. $63,000. Over 14 months, in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. Greer stared at the document. My stepmother's hand moved to her husband's arm. My father's face went through several things in quick succession. I watched all of them. Alderton put her glasses back on. She said very quietly that in light of this new information, she would be recommending a pause on all estate proceedings pending a full accounting review. She said she would also be noting in her file that the challenge to testamentary capacity appeared to lack evidentiary foundation. Greer said he needed a moment with his clients. Whitfield said of course, and we stepped into the hallway. In the hallway, he looked at me with something I recognized as professional admiration and said, "You let her say it." "I knew she would," I said. "She's been rehearsing that speech for 30 years. You could have disclosed your position at the start." "I could have," I said. I didn't tell him the rest. That it wasn't strategy, not entirely. That a part of me had needed to sit in that room and hear her say it out loud in front of witnesses with a court-adjacent professional at the head of the table. I needed it documented. I needed the words to exist somewhere outside of my own memory, where they had lived for so long that I'd sometimes wondered if I was misremembering, if I was being unfair to her. I was not misremembering. I was not being unfair. We went back in 20 minutes later. Greer informed Alderton that his clients would be withdrawing the challenge to the amended will. He said this with the particular neutrality of a man who has just had a very unpleasant conversation and is trying to move past it. My stepmother said nothing. She looked at the window. My father looked at nothing I could name. Alderton nodded. She said the proceedings would move forward according to my grandmother's amended will. She said any questions about the financial transfers would be referred to the appropriate authorities for review, which she was obligated to do under her professional responsibilities. That last part I hadn't fully anticipated, but I wasn't sorry. In the elevator going down, Whitfield said, "What do you want to do about the transfers?" "Whatever the law requires," I said. He nodded. He'd expected that answer. In the lobby, I put on my coat. The April air outside was cold and bright, the kind of Chicago spring that can't decide if it's still winter. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute before I went to my car. I thought about my mother. I thought about the trust she'd set up when she was sick and scared and trying to make sure I'd be okay. I thought about my grandmother beating me at Scrabble. I thought about the lake house in Wisconsin that I'd visited once as a child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, before my mother got sick. I have one memory of it, blurry and warm, tall pines and green water and my mother's hand in mine on the dock. That house is mine now. The first time I drove up to see it, I stood on that same dock for a long time. I didn't cry in the conference room. I don't cry in rooms where it costs me something. But I stood on that dock in early May, in the cold, with the water moving slow and dark beneath the boards, and I let myself have it. My mother had known. Somehow, across 30 years, and everything that came after, she had known that I would need something to hold on to. She had made sure I had it. That's the thing about people who really love you. They think about you even when they're the ones who are scared. They make provisions, they leave you things not just in the material sense. They leave you proof that you were seen, proof that you were seen, proof that you mattered, proof that somebody, somewhere, counted you as real. Not a name on a form, not a paperwork inconvenience. Theirs. The financial review took 4 months. I won't go into all of it. Some of it is still pending, and Whitfield has advised me to be careful about what I say publicly. What I will tell you is that $63,000 in unexplained transfers from an elderly woman's accounts, made in structured increments, draws a particular kind of attention from a particular kind of office. I don't work that case directly. Conflict of interest, obviously. But I know the people who do, and I know they're thorough. My father called me in September. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known about all of it, which may or may not be true. That's not mine to determine anymore. He said he hoped we could talk someday. I haven't called back. Maybe I will. I don't know yet. I've stopped making promises to myself about forgiveness because I've found that forgiveness isn't a decision you make once. It's something that either arrives eventually on its own schedule or it doesn't, and pretending otherwise just makes you a liar. What I know is this: I'm not angry the way I used to be. The anger I carried for years was the anger of someone who hadn't been believed, who hadn't been seen, who kept waiting for someone to ask the right question. Once the question got asked, once the room finally knew what I knew, something in me settled. Not healed, settled. There's a difference. I go to the lake house when I can. Weekends mostly, sometimes a long Friday if I can get away. I've been fixing it up slowly. New porch boards, a kitchen faucet that doesn't drip, a coat of paint on the shutters that my grandmother had been meaning to get to. I do a lot of it myself. I've learned to like the work, the specific satisfaction of a thing that was broken being fixed by your own hands. Last October, I found a box in the upstairs closet. Old photos mostly, my grandparents' wedding, holidays I didn't recognize, summers at the lake spanning decades. At the bottom of the box was an envelope with my name on it in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside was a single index card. For my girl, it said. The house always knew you were coming back. I've kept the card in my jacket pocket since then. It sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Some people spend their whole lives trying to get one person to see them, really see them, without conditions, without a version of you that's more convenient for their story. If you're lucky, you find that person. If you're very lucky, they leave you proof. I was lucky, and I am, finally, exactly where I'm supposed to be.